Good morning, guys. So it's time for us to start to talk about World War II. Just like every other war that we've looked at in this class, what we're interested in is the causes of the war and the outcomes of the war. We're much less interested in what's actually going to happen during the wars. So today's a big day as far as why did World War II happen? You would think after the horrors of World War One that nobody would ever, under any circumstances, want to do something like that again. In World War One, there was tens of millions of dead, tens and tens of millions of wounded. You had entire societies destroyed. World War One ends in 1918. And just 21 years later, in 1939, there's a sequel. So the question has to be why? Why did this happen a second time? And there's going to be 5 major reasons for the start of World War II. We're going to look at some of these in depth, and some of these we've already talked about in some good depth. So I'm not going to have to go back and rehash it with you. So the first one is what your guide calls, the course description calls, the unsustainable peace after World War One. After World War One, for lack of a better term, a just peace that satisfied all the previous combatants was not achieved. Remember, after World War One, so many states were upset about the terms of the peace that were involved, including sides that won. You have, for example, a very, 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 very bitter Germany who thinks that the obligations they have under the treaty are too harsh. The pain of reparations, the limiting of the size of the military, the loss of land that they had. And the German people were left incredibly angry. You have the Soviet Union. Remember, Russia was the country that lost the most land and the most people in World War One. And they're not taken care of at all by this peace that ended the war. So there's lots of anger and bitterness there as well. You have Japan, a side that theoretically was on the country that was theoretically on the side that won, leaving the Treaty of Versailles angry and upset. You have Italy, a side that switched sides to join the Allies in World War One, feeling like they had been lied and betrayed to when the treaty was over. Really, truly, that treaty that ended World War One, it was made to benefit France. It was made to benefit Britain. And in many of the other places, there's lots of anger, there's lots of animosity, there's lots of bitterness, and that anger and that animosity and that bitterness is just going to linger and linger and linger and get worse and worse and worse. Also, I can't emphasize this enough. If you're going to try to have an international peace, if you're going to try to bring stability and prosperity back after a major war like this, you really need the involvement of the most powerful country on earth, and that's the United States of America. Well, the United States of America had basically withdrawn from foreign relations after World War I. We are not economically isolated. We're the world's leading industrial power. We are the world's leading trade power by this point. But we withdraw politically, and we talked about that in our previous video about how, while some things like the League of Nations was the innovation and invention of an American president, Woodrow Wilson, the United States government itself decided not to join because of fears of entangling itself in European affairs. And specifically because we were afraid that a second war might happen and we didn't want to get involved. Well, it was really hard to have a sustainable peace with the most powerful country on earth, and that's what the United States was after World War I. Was not an active participant in that peace. So all of these are going to be a problem. Number two, the global economic depression after World War I. This does a lot of things to set the table for World War II. Number one, in the democracies that won, the United States, Britain, and France, it causes this enormous domestic crisis, unemployment, closure of banks, a full-on economic collapse that we haven't seen in the modern world yet. And this domestic crisis caused these countries and the leaders in these countries to look within so deeply to try to fix the problems that they were less interested in foreign affairs and the rise of threats outside of their state. The other thing it does is for totalitarian leaders, and a totalitarian leader is someone who has complete and total power. In places like Germany, Hitler, in places like Italy, Mussolini, in places like the Soviet Union, Stalin. It gives those leaders a problem to solve. And we've talked about, and we'll continue to talk about how those leaders solve those problems. But the bottom line is, it gave those leaders a chance to consolidate their power and to get aggressive in their expansion, while the major democracies were kind of turning their back to the major events of what was going on outside of their states. There's continued imperial aspirations. Now, the two major imperial powers after World War I are Britain and France. Well, guess what? Other powers want to get into the imperialism game too. And those powers are Italy and Japan. Well, Italy and Japan are like, hey, if those countries get to have imperial empires, why can't we? You're going to see both of these states that are totalitarian are going to try aggressive expansion. And this aggressive expansion is going to be a direct cause into the events that ultimately lead to World War II. Especially big cause is the rise of totalitarian leaders with complete and total power. And I'm going to go into this in more depth in this slide, like Hitler, like Stalin, like Mussolini, like the military dictatorship of Japan, and the rise of fascists like Hitler, and a very, very, very problematic policy called appeasement. So know that these are the 5 causes. Now, I'm not going to go any more into the unsustainable peace or the global economic crisis caused by the Great Depression. I'm going to focus the rest of this lesson on the other 3 things. Imperial aspirations of Japan and Italy. After World War I, Japan felt like the Western democracies were never going to trust them and treat them fairly. And Japan goes down a very militant, aggressive pathway that's going to ultimately lead to Pearl Harbor. In 1931, Japan is going to attack China. One of the interesting things is one of the only countries that World War I was really great for was actually China, because all those imperial powers with spheres of influence, those European powers with spheres of influence in China, when World War I started, they left to go fight each other in Europe. Well, this opens a door for Japan. In 1931, Japan is going to attack China's controlled Manchuria, and they're also going to conquer Korea. And this is aggressive imperial expansion. And this is still imperialism because Japan is an industrialized power taking over non-industrialized regions. And then in 1937 itself, Japan attacks China. This attack in China is massive. And they are trying to conquer the whole thing. They're trying to take over China to gain their resources. their populations. This is part of a policy to dominate the Pacific region and Asia of the world. They're the one industrial power in this region, and they're trying to cash in on this. Meanwhile, in 1935, Italy is going to attack the one part of Africa that had not become a colony yet, and this is the state of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is on the east coast of Africa. I'm going to show you a map of this in a second. And this is another example of just wanton imperialism. We're a strong industrial power. And by this point, Italy is an industrial power. I know we didn't emphasize that in our last period. They're going to try to take over in an industrialized region. Here's the big problem that's associated with imperial aspirations of these places. If only there had been an international organization designed to keep peace created after World War I. Oh, wait, there was one. That was the League of Nations. The League of Nations was specifically created after World War I to keep things like this from ever happening again. And the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 and the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 were the first real chance that the League of Nations had to act. And either way, the League of Nations is going to send a very strong message to states that might be interested in expansion through conquest. Either they're going to aggressively react and send a message that says this will not be tolerated, or they're not going to react strongly enough. And aggressive dictatorships are like, oh, cool, we can do this, and there's not going to be anyone who stops us. Unfortunately for the world, the League of Nations fails to act to stop either one of these instances of aggression. And a big part of this is racism. Soviet Union is not part of the League of Nations. The United States isn't part of the League of Nations. The two countries that are dominating it are Britain and France. Britain and France have no interest in fighting and sending British and French soldiers as part of a mission of the League of Nations during the Great Depression to save non-white, non-Christians in Asia and in Africa. They fail to stop these acts of aggression. And other leaders are looking at this, like Hitler, like Stalin, like Mussolini. And when they see that the League of Nations isn't actually going to actively do anything, that's a green light for them. An example of this was during the Ethiopia crisis when Italy was attacking Ethiopia. This is Italy. This is Ethiopia. How do you attack Ethiopia? Well, you have to send soldiers by sea. Well, there's two ways to get to Ethiopia. There's the long freaking way all the way around Africa, or by this point, the Suez Canal had been built. The Suez Canal was controlled by the British after World War I. In the official meetings of the League of Nations, the British ambassador to the League of Nations is yelling and screaming and acting like the British are outraged by the Italian attacks in Ethiopia. But at the same time, the British are allowing the Italians to sail their fleet through the Suez Canal because they don't want a war to start. Livy, you need to go inside. Now, so nothing was done to stop these actions, these activities. And in the case of Japan, they're building an imperial empire. And this imperial empire is going to consist of, again, attacking China itself, islands in the Pacific, and nobody does anything to stop that. All right, so that's strike one. The next big issue is these totalitarian leaders who want to expand the territory and strength of their state. There's three big culprits in this. And it's important to know who's communist and who's fascist. Stalin is a totalitarian leader of the Soviet Union. He's communist. Hitler and Mussolini. Hitler is the leader of Germany. Mussolini is the leader of Italy. Both of these are fascists. Talked about communist philosophy. We need to take a second to talk about, well, what is fascism? Fascism is an extremely militant form of nationalism. Leadership dresses in army uniforms. There's this structuring of society based around military power, might, and prestige. If you've ever seen a picture of Hitler, and I'll show you some later, he's always dressed in a military uniform. It's got this glorification of militantism that's associated with it. It's also got this extremely nationalist bent, and this is something that all fascists believe in. We are the greatest nation. There's always a racist philosophy associated with it. We are the greatest nation. We have this right to rule, to dominate, and control. All fascists are looking to expand aggressively because they think that is their right. They're also going to look to purge people in their societies who are not from that nation. For example, in Germany, Jews. They're diluting our strength. They're less pure. We need to get rid of them. That is a fascist philosophy. Now, there's extremely strong government with extremely powerful dictators, but they are not communists. There's still private land ownership. There's still private corporations. Now, those private corporations are oftentimes deeply in bed and in league with the government, and we'll get to that story later on. But they are a dictatorship philosophy, and they are a militant philosophy, but they're not a communist philosophy. I want you to know for the time being that fascists and communists do not get down. Okay? If you were to draw a line, and on, well, this is, I'll do it for you guys. This is the left. This is liberals. This is the modern day Democratic Party. The extreme left is communism. If you were to draw a line, continue that line to the right side, when we say right, we talk about conservatives. We thought, Republicans. The extreme right is fascists. Fascists and communists are on the two extremes of political ideology, and they hate each other. Remember that. That becomes important to our story. But they are both totalitarian philosophies. Now, the other big thing that's going to lead directly to World War II is a British and French policy called appeasement. Because of how war-weary they are, and because they're suffering from the internal crisis of the Great Depression, the British and the French are going to have multiple opportunities to stop acts of fascist aggression, and they choose not to. Appeasement is the British and French policies of giving Hitler whatever he wanted to, basically, in the belief that by giving him the things he asked for, it would keep a major war from happening. Unfortunately, all appeasement ultimately does is make it so that when there is a war, Hitler is strong, he's powerful, and he's ready for it. Let me give you some examples of appeasement. Hitler is going to openly violate the Treaty of Versailles in a series of ways. Every time he violates the Treaty of Versailles, Britain and France legally, with the backing allegedly of the League of Nations, would have had the right to come in and attack Germany. The earlier they would have attacked Germany, the smaller the war would have been, the less powerful Hitler would have been, and this threat could have been taken care of. For example, in 1933, not long after Hitler comes to power, you will see on this map this river in blue. This river is the Rhine River. One of the parts of the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany never, for posterity, never could Germany have a soldier west of the Rhine River. This territory between the Rhine River and France is called the Rhineland. This was essentially meant to be a demilitarized zone. The only reason Germany would ever have troops in the Rhineland would be to attack France. That's the only reason. So that was why this was part of the treaty. You can't have troops here. You can't threaten France. In 1933, not long after he became chancellor, Hitler marches troops into the Rhineland. It was a big national parade. Hitler's generals were holding their head going, oh my God, what is this nutcase doing? There's no way Britain and France are going to allow us to do that. He marches troops into the Rhineland, and Britain and France did nothing. This was the first time they could have made a stand against us. If they had attacked Germany in 1933, the war lasts 2 months. Hitler's not ready for it. And they squash this, but they're so desperate to keep the peace, and they're dealing with this internal economic depression that they're like, let's just give him what he wants. It's not that big of a deal. Sorry, I said 1933. That was 1935. In 1933, in a direct, I got my stuff mixed up. In 1933, before he remilitarized the Rhineland, Hitler starts to actively rebuild his military. The Treaty of Versailles said that Germany could only have a very, very, very limited sized military. Well, if you will remember, when we talked about how did Hitler solve the problems of the Great Depression in Germany, it was remilitarization. He built up his army, he built up his industry, he exceeded the size that his army was allowed to have, he built weapons that he wasn't allowed to have, in a level that he wasn't allowed to have those weapons in. And Britain and France did nothing. So he rebuilds his military. Britain and France do nothing. Like, it's not that big of a deal. We have the Great Depression to deal with. He reoccupies the Rhineland. What's the real problem here anyway? It's not worth us attacking him. He stops paying reparations. We talked about that should have been a problem. Britain and France like, just let it go. In 1936, though, now things are starting to get a little bit more dicey. So this right here is Austria. If you'll remember, Austria was an ally of Germany in World War I. Austria is a shell of the size it was. Austria loses most of its territory after World War I. Most of what is left in Austria, the people that are left in Austria, are Germans. So you have Germans living in Germany, and you have Germans living in Austria. Hitler is absolutely a nationalist, and he wants to unite all the German people into one state. Well, part of the Treaty of Versailles had said Germany and Austria could never, ever be united into a single state. In 1936, Nazis assassinate the Austrian prime minister. After they do that, Hitler declares a national emergency and he marches troops into Austria. The Austrian people overwhelmingly are excited about this union with Germany. It wasn't like an aggressive military campaign. Again, it was like a national parade. One of my favorite movies, and you're probably going to laugh at home, is because I love musicals, is The Sound of Music. The Sound of Music is the story of the Nazi occupation of Austria. And if you've ever seen the movie, the Austrian Germans are very excited. But now Germany and Austria are being merged into a single state. And this single state is just giving more resources and just giving more power to Hitler. When this happens, there's no way Britain and France should have taken this line down. But they do. And now everything Hitler does is working. Every time his generals say that they'll never ever let you do this, and they let him do this, he just gets stronger. He just gets more popular with the people. And every year you wait, this war that's going to happen, that's ultimately going to be inevitable, is going to be really, really, really bad. One of the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles was that Germany could never form a military alliance with any other states. In 1938, Hitler forms an alliance with Italy and Japan. It's called the Triple Alliance. And now it really should be code red. Totalitarian leaders from three powerful states are joining together to fight together. Why Britain and France take this lying down, I have no idea, except they just believe that there's no way that Germany would want another major war after the horrors of what just happened. And they've just completely misunderstood who they're dealing with in Hitler. And in 1938, in the fall of 1938, you have the straw that kind of breaks the camel's back. So by 1938, without firing a shot, Hitler controls Germany, Hitler controls Austria, Hitler controls Italy, and he also has an alliance with Japan. Well, you can look at this. From Austria and from Germany, there's a brand new country created after World War I that you're directly threatening, and that is the state of Czechoslovakia. Now, the western portion of Czechoslovakia is a region called the Sudetenland. In the Sudetenland, after World War I, when this country was made, there is a large ethnic German minority of people. Hitler tells Czechoslovakia in September of 1938, you have 1 month to give me the Sudetenland. If you do not give me the Sudetenland, I'm going to attack. And he can attack Czechoslovakia from three sides. Now, one of the problems is Britain and France had a treaty with Czechoslovakia that said, if you're attacked, we have to come to your aid. And Czechoslovakia basically tells Hitler, come and try to take it. We have allies. This is our homeland. We're not giving this to you. And every day that ticked off in September of 1938 was one day closer to the October 1st ultimatum, and one day closer to where it looked like war was about to take place. And basically, the leaders of Britain and France are peeing themselves because everything they've done the last 6 years was designed to give Hitler what he wanted, to keep the peace. And now it looks like they're going to get dragged into a war they don't want to fight. And they can't believe they've let this happen. As the days roll down in September of 1938, and it becomes more and more likely that a war could take place, Hitler does what I would argue is his most brilliant move in all the buildup to this war. And I mean like a Dr. Evil trying to take over the world type of way. I'm not praising him, but I'm saying if your goal was world domination, this was a pretty smooth move he did. The week before the ultimatum was up, Hitler sends a message to the Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, and the President of France, inviting them to fly to Munich, Germany, where he would like to meet with them face to face to try to settle the problem of the Sudetenland. At the meeting, famously, Hitler has a private meeting with Neville Chamberlain, and Hitler looks Chamberlain in the eye and says, I was a soldier in World War I. I saw all the bloodshed. I saw all the pain. Never in a million years would I want to bring that to my people. But you have to admit, it's not right that there are hundreds of thousands of Germans living in Czechoslovakia and not living in Germany. Let me have the Sudetenland. And I promise you, this is the last thing I'm ever going to ask for. He's convincing. And the Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, says, deal. And the British and the French sell out their Czechoslovakian allies. The Czechs weren't even invited to the meeting. And Chamberlain tells the Czechs, give up the Sudetenland. We're not going to come to your aid, but we promise you everything will be fine. Famously, and when I'm done with this video, I'm going to pull up the YouTube clip. Chamberlain gets into a plane and flies back to London. The media, when his airplane lands, goes rushing to the tarmac because they don't know what's been decided. Chamberlain comes down the stairs, takes the Munich Agreement, waves it in the air. The Munich Agreement is the agreement to give the Germans the Sudetenland. Waves the agreement in the air and says, I have just ensured peace for all time. And this is the biggest gift he could ever give Hitler. Hitler gets to take over the Sudetenland. 3 months later, claiming there was some sort of Czechoslovakian crisis, he takes over the rest of the state. And by this point, the Allies finally realized, oh my goodness, we've been duped. And the war increasingly seems inevitable. Now, hold on just a second. To make things worse for Britain and France, after this, by February of 1939, Hitler has control of Germany. He now has control of all of Czechoslovakia. He has control of Austria. He has this alliance with Italy, and he has an alliance with the Japanese. Once he's taken over all of Czechoslovakia, it becomes very, very clear what his next target is going to be. His next target is going to be the state of Poland. Once he has Czechoslovakia, he can attack Poland from 3 directions. He can attack it from Germany proper. He can attack it from Czechoslovakia. And this right here, this is called East Prussia. East Prussia was part of Germany. This was part of the wonky map drawing after World War I. The Germans didn't like the fact that there was a part of Germany separated from Germany, and this is going to be part of the justification Hitler's going to use to threaten Poland. Now, Britain and France by this point are like, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. But there is one thing that the British and the French felt like they had going for them. This map doesn't show it great. This right here, this border, is the border to the Soviet Union. The British and the French had convinced themselves, well, the one thing that is guaranteed to happen if Germany attacks Poland is the Soviets will go to war with them, because the Soviets will never, ever, ever want fascists on their border. And this is when Hitler does his brilliant maneuver, part 2, again in a Dr. Evil sort of way. In the summer of 1939, he swallows his pride and he sends an ambassador to Stalin. And this has always been the way that I have envisioned how this meeting took place. Hey, Stalin, you're a crazy nutbag murderous dictator. I am a crazy nutbag murderous dictator. Let's be frenzies. Let's make a pinky pact, because the one thing we both really don't like are democracies. So let's do this. I will sign an agreement saying I will not fight you for 10 years if you will promise not to attack me for 10 years. And we'll go halvesies on Poland. I'll attack Poland from the west. You can attack it from the east, and you can also swallow up these little states that were created after World War I from your territory, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. We'll split that puppy up in half between us. You'll get more land and population and land back that you lost in World War I. I'll get more land back and population that we lost in World War I, and nobody will be there to stop us. Now, the 10-year non-aggression pact part of this treaty was made public when Britain and France heard that the German fascists and the Soviet communists had signed an agreement like this. They were like, oh, crud. Because now the only states that are there to stop Germany are Britain and France, because the United States has basically said we don't care. And the biggest country they were counting on to stop fascist aggression, the communist Soviet Union, has now made an agreement with them. And what they underestimate is, yes, fascists and communists don't like each other, but what fascists and communists really don't like are democracies. And the war starts September 1st, 1939. September 1st, 1939, Germany attacks Poland from 3 directions. Poland had a treaty with Britain and France saying, if we are attacked, you have to come to our aid. Britain and France were like, hey, we know we kind of screwed the Czechs over, but we're not going to do that to you. But look at the geography of Poland. What could the British and the French actually do to save them? And the answer is nothing. Germany is tearing them up. After a month in this invasion, the Poles are getting ready to make a heroic last stand. And to the utter horror of the world, the secret part of this agreement kicks in. What they did not make public was the agreement to split Poland between them, and the Soviet army invades from the east. And now Britain and France are like, oh, God. Are they actually allies? And there's nothing they can do to save the Poles. And this is the action that actually starts World War I, the invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. And it's going to plunge the world into 6 more years of darkness. Now, the very, very, very last thing I want to say about the start of the war is this. Many historians, including Ron DeQuattro, don't really think that the invasion of Poland is the proper event to start the war. But this is the most widely given event to start the war. Increasingly in the historical community, there is a belief that the actual beginning of the war is when Japan attacks China in 1937. And the reason for that is Japan won't stop fighting people until Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So I understand both arguments. The traditional date for the start of World War II, though, is the German invasion in 1939 and of Poland in 1939. And by this point,